All right, so Josh will have selected something that I have not heard from Spaced Cowboy yet, but I'm sure it will be super interesting. So before I get into this, Matt, why don't you tell us where There's a Riot Going On by Sly and the Family Stone stacks up in the numbers?
So in the 1970s, there's a riot going on at number 92 for the decade, and number 17 in 1971, and 373 of all time.
There we go. All right, so when last we were with Sly and the Family Stone, it was 1969, and we did the album Stand, and this, of course, led into Sly and the Family Stone's two most famous performances, the first at the so-called Black Woodstock, the Harlem Cultural Festival, and then 3 weeks later at Woodstock, where they gave a very critically acclaimed performance. Unfortunately, this coincided with lots of things happening in Sly and the Family Stone between that album and this album in 1971. Would you like to hear the various things that went on between 1969 at Woodstock and 1971,
Can I guess
guys?
some of them?
You can, but it might be better just to hear one at a time because it goes gradually more insane. But Josh, go ahead and make one guess as to one thing that may have happened.
Drug use.
Correct.
Wait, along those same lines, I have a guess.
Go ahead.
They were breathing oxygen.
Yes, correct.
That's just about as predictable as the drug use that Josh just laid out.
I was wondering where you're going with that, Matt, but yes, that was this boy, or
That's
this is
all
going to be
I've
an
got.
interest. Yes. Well, there's a lot. We'll get to drugs. Don't worry. Number one is the Stone Brothers and Larry Graham started having a feud that ultimately led to Larry Graham leaving the band. And if you remember, Larry Graham is who produces the bass lines of Sly and the Family Stone that were so prominently featured on Stand. This album, as you may have noticed, does not have quite as many signature bass lines on it. No. And many of them were laid down by session players and or electronic devices. So Larry Graham's robots, yes, robot bassist. Now we'll get there's a whole section on like how he recorded this. So I just don't want to get into there yet before we get there. But that's kind of my thing there. Number two is that Epic Records and Clive Davis wanted more marketable songs because they were going a long time between 1969 and when this was released in 1971, with only one single released during that time. Perhaps one of the reasons why there's only one single released is because shortly after Woodstock in mid-1969, or during Woodstock and shortly afterwards, the band became involved heavily with many different drugs, most notably PCP and cocaine. Wow. Famously, Sly Stallone carried a violin case full of drugs with him everywhere that he went, and many people say that Sly Stone's entire 1970 was lost to drug use. However, he was not the only member of the band partaking, but I put up some clips on the Twitter account, and you had him on the Mike Douglas show, and boy, oh boy, was Mr. Stone high as a kite on that. And I'm talking high on that show.
No, Dick Cavett.
Dick Cavett, I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. He was on. I apologize. I put the Dick Cavett show up. He was also on Mike Douglas as well, and he did back-to-back interviews that were notorious for his level of highness.
Which one was he higher on? Maybe we could.
Everybody. Well, it's funny you say that. Because I'm going to tell some stories, and I'm going to guess PCP is going to be the one that he was going off of, perhaps a little bit more based on some stuff. However, number four was. Sly Stone was involved with the Black Panther Party, who wanted him to replace the band's manager, David Kapralik, and the two white members of the group, Greg Rico and Jerry Martini, with black musicians and a black businessman, implying them as the manager, to replace him. And this led to Sly Stone hiring a couple of people who are almost always referred to as streetwise and or streetwise thugs as his managers, and a couple of, as it was often described, mafia tangential bodyguards to be around him at all times. Basically, Sly Stone at this point was increasingly paranoid, something that both PCP and cocaine are well known for, and felt that everyone, including the other band members, were his enemies. So needless to say, the camaraderie and vision in Stand was not there. Another thing that became very clear, and this album is kind of known as a combo of Sly Stone degenerating into drug use, as well as basically his idealism being crushed. And that was another big thing of this, is that Sly Stone became increasingly disillusioned with sort of the American idea and even some of the stuff that he was singing on as recently as 1969. Because of that, he was kind of in a dark place, and unfortunately kind of stayed in a dark place throughout the 70s and 80s, fighting addictions. He only released one single between the summer of 1969 and fall of 1971 when this album came out, and that was Thank You / Everybody Is a Star, which was two different songs. One sounded a lot like vintage Sly and the Family Stone, and one was a lot more darker and socio-political in terms of the lyrics. By the early 1971, Errico, the drummer, was gone. He was replaced by Jerry Gibson in the band, and pretty much on this album, being the drummer was not really much because Sly Stone was using an electric drum machine on this machine pretty much exclusively when he was doing his recording. So there was a drummer for live shows. It's important to know that Sly Stone himself missed 1/3 of the band's live shows in 1970. So if you went to go see Sly Stone and Sly and the Family Stone in 1970, you only had a 2/3 chance of seeing Sly Stone at Sly and the Family Stone concerts. Yes,
but you had a 100% chance of seeing him on PCP or GOIN.
Yeah, pretty. Touche, Josh. Touche. Yes. There's a Riot Going On is released, and it's a complete mystery to most people because it's largely a Sly Stone solo album. He would bring in some session players, Ike Turner, Billy Preston, Bobby Womack, pretty famous, session players throughout the 60s. And we've talked about Ike Turner in one before, but he pretty much just worked on this album in a studio known as the Record Plant in Sausalito, California, in his home in Bel Air. The rest of the band was not super involved in it. His sister sang on a couple songs, most notably A Family Affair, but the rest of the band, like we said, Errico was gone by this point, and a drum machine was utilized frequently. One thing that I thought was really interesting about this was somehow in this sort of being this drug addlement, he actually was able to negotiate a production deal with Atlantic Records for a total of 1 year. It was called Stone Flower Productions, and it actually released singles from 4 artists, including a song, Somebody's Watching You by Little Sister, which is sort of well known for being the first popular recording to feature a drum machine. So, yeah, so for a year, he was together enough to at least record some stuff and then to work on this album on and off. By early 72, after this album, Jerry Martini's just about gone from the band, and then Larry Graham and Sly Stone have a pretty major and often reported violent falling out. There's some talk of a fist fight. There was the belief by Sly Stone that Larry Graham had hired someone to kill him. This has never been proven, but it was what Sly Stone believed, and of course led to a pretty violent confrontation along the way. So that's kind of unfortunately where it's trending. Some things about the album. The original title for the album was Africa Talks to You, but then Marvin Gaye in early 1971 released the album What's Going On, and Sly renamed the album as an answer to that album. And it's There's a Riot Going On. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So that's where that comes from. Even though this album sounds remarkably different from the rest of Sly Stallone's output, Family Affair still topped the pop singles chart, and it actually sold relatively well early, if not super critically well received. The critics were as much baffled by this album as it was not well received, because it's just so very, very different, as we'll talk about. A lot of people have said this sort of Sly Stone in 1971 sort of represents the dark side of the African-American experience at this point. If the 1969 album Stand was the hopeful experience, then this sort of is like the counter narrative to that, a lot darker, more depressing. There is a very common theme of socio-political messages in the lyrics of this album. There is a definite drug influence on this album. This album, to some degree, sounds like taking drugs, which we'll talk about when we're in it, I think, a little bit, when we kind of explore what that sounds like. For those that are music buffs, I talked about the drum machine here. The musicality of the album was primarily from the Maestro Rhythm King MRK2. What Stone did was he did not use the machine as intended. He instead overdubbed, the drum sounds to make the album sound denser and thus darker. And the editing of the album, when he did record with members of the band, he only recorded with them one at a time in two-person collaborations. He then overdubbed, erased, and mixed everything to make... And the effect of that was the fact that the lyrics on most of the songs on this album are kind of unintelligible or garbled at times. There's a lot of times you can't really understand what's being said, and that was kind of what the production was supposed to be. Couple things about the cover of this album, which was well known. The cover of this album is an American flag, but instead of the stars, there are suns on it. And here, I thought this was an interesting quote from Sly Stone. He says that the red, white, and black American flag with the suns in place of stars. Black was designed to represent the absence of color, white because it is the combination of all colors, and red because it is what all people have in common, blood. The reason he picked the suns was there are too many stars in the world. And his final quote, which I found to be somewhat humorous, Betsy Ross did the best she could with what she had. I thought I could do better. So that was his description of his flag, which was fantastic. You may also notice, and this is the last thing I'll do before I kick it to you guys, that the title track on this album, There's a Riot Going On, if you go to Spotify, is a grand total of 4 seconds. On the album, it was actually no seconds. And a lot of people thought that that stemmed from the fact that Sly and the Family Stone was supposed to perform a concert in Grant Park in Chicago, but a riot broke out, and the concert never went off. So some people thought that was symbolic. Stone himself said in 1997 that it had no time count because he felt that there should be no riots, hence the 0 minutes and 0 seconds. So you can choose what you want. So there is a little context on There's a Riot Going On by Sly and the Family Stone. We were going to cover the greatest hits on Cold Listen Hot Take, but I kind of removed it because only 2 of the greatest hits on that album will not have been covered in the 2 albums we've covered so far. So that was released in between these 2 albums, basically to tread water between them. Guys, let's start with Josh. What do you think of There's a Riot Going On by Sly and the Family Stone?
Well, like critics, I was also confounded by this album and borderline did not like it. I found it repetitive. I was put off by the fact that there was no lyrics really or seemingly any sort of kind of emotion to it compared to the previous album. It felt like instrumental funk music.
Do you want to describe what the lyrics sound like on this album, Josh? Because I think for somebody who may not have heard it before, that might be helpful.
It's just a lot of repeating of the same thing, and it is garbled or muddy when they are saying something, to the point where I can't even remember lyrics other than Family Affair. I guess there's just kind of like a repeating chorus often. What comes to mind about the lyrics for you, John?
And not much, which is why it stands out, because he's singing on these tracks, but you would have to slow it down and really methodically listen. And I tried to do that a couple times, and even in doing that, there's often times where it's unintelligible. You really can't. And there's even, when you try to search out lyrics, there's differences of opinion of what's being said on some of these tracks. So yeah, it's very, very different from the crystalline lyrics of Stand, where you can pretty much understand everything that's going on.
You definitely don't feel the negativity in the album, especially in comparison to Stand, which I felt like was a very positive album and contributions from everybody in the band. This definitely sounds like just Sly in the studio, using drum machines and stuff on an album. To me, it's almost the definition of an album you put on in the background when you're just like working or something. It's almost like that sort of there's nothing to really grab onto or pay attention to. It's almost just like classical music or something else that you would just use. That's what I felt like. it's like funk music without lyrics, without sort of any sort of emotion, I guess, for a better word. It really it was confusing because, like you said, it was very different from the first album, and like halfway through every song I felt like I got what the song was trying to do, and I was like, okay, next song. I mean, I did listen to the album all the way, but after subsequent listens, it was, I don't even get the, I mean, it's clearly drug influenced, I feel like, just in kind of its, there's no structure, I would say, or there's a loose structure. It doesn't seem very focused or coherent, I guess, which would be impactful of drugs. And I'm disappointed. I wouldn't listen to this again.
Okay. Matt, how about you? What are your initial thoughts?
So I don't feel like I am SLY's target market with this record. And
who do you think is?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm with Josh here. I'm a little confused. I think that one of the things that stands out for me is kind of along the lines that Josh was saying is that and John, you've talked about this before too. There's no hooks here, right? There's nothing that's really, kind of grabbing me at all.
No, except for Family Affair. It's about the only song.
Yeah,
with
but
the
even
hook.
that, I thought that was a weak hook. Like, I'm like, okay, I could, and that is something. It's in my head right now. It's one of the parts of this record that can definitely stick with you. And it's fine, right? I think this overall, this album's it's not offensive, right? It's just it is a little confusing. There's certainly beats and the bass parts in here. I could find some grooves, but I had to kind of really listen intently to them because they're not right up front, which brings me to the other main takeaway here, which is the production of the record. It's very minimalistic. And by that I mean
absolutely,
like it's almost like whatever they're doing, everything is faded to the background. There's nothing that's crisp and clear up front. There's a lot of space on these songs, right? There's stuff always going on, but it always seemed like to me this would have been much better had they done more in the production, that they would have layered things on top of it, that they would have brought things more to the forefront. And I just felt like it was just kind of hanging out in the background. And I agree with Josh, this is something that's fine to put on the background, but it didn't really move me. There's a couple of different songs here that I liked better. I did like Space Cowboy. I kind of thought that was a little interesting, kind of funky. He's yodeling a little bit. It kind of was a little different thing on it. I really did like the last track. Thank you for talking to me, Africa, which had that was like the best bass line in this record. Yep. And it's that bass line is up front. It is repetitive. It's a long song. It's over 7 minutes, but I felt that groove. And if the rest of this record was like that, I would like it a lot more. But yeah, and a lot of times with a number of these songs as they first come on, it sounds like a 70s porn soundtrack. Like it's like a wow chicka wow wow. It's like and I'm just laughing. I'm like, where's the dude coming in with the and that's kind of the other takeaway. I was like, this is just I don't know. It seems very much of its time, and I am kind of confused, right? And this actually, I looked at the Rolling Stone list. This is like in the top 100 on the Rolling Stone list of all times. It's like that might be 98 or something. Wow. It's in the high 90s. So I don't know. I thought Stand was much better. I thought it was more fun to listen to. It was much easier to dance to. I think this was even hard to dance to it sometimes. It was kind of like, there's the bass. You have to search for it. So, I don't think I would go back to this. I was disappointed as well. I kept waiting for that song to come by to hit me, and it never really did. Maybe the last song is the closest that I got to that as an overall whole. But very strange record for me.
I can understand him, after John giving some background on where he was at. I can understand an album being dark or being in a dark place, but it's not like a good use of energy. I don't get the negativity or kind of despair or kind of what's the word I'm looking for? The loss that he was feeling about his positivity.
That's really interesting that you say that.
Because I guess I think more of like in contrast, like the Roberta Flack album, I feel like that was kind of a more realistic portrayal of like what people might be feeling or going through, and that didn't come across in this album for me.
So here's what I would say to that. So I try to, before I do my research on an album, I try to write down my thoughts before I get any bio, so that I'm not influenced by it. Mm-hmm. So I kind of don't have a take that's caused by, oh, well, that's my take because it's on the album. And the first time I listened to this album afterwards, I said, this album sounds like what I would imagine Opium feels like to be on, is my initial description. It just felt like it was, I mean, from what I could get from the lyrics, I could tell that there was definitely a political bend to it and a drug bend on it. And the lyrics I could get were on both of those two subjects, right? Yeah. I look at this as someone who was sort of lost their innocence a little bit on the country and turned to drugs. And, in the 60s, people turned to drugs for a lot of reasons, but sort of like drug use was to some degree celebrated, right? It was considered to be a creative outlet and different stuff, but it had a real toll, on people who died early and people whose lives were different. I mean, it's, even folks that were able to come out of it, they don't look back on, that time as a lot of lost time, right? And I look at this as one of the few instances where you can see, like, when drugs were being used as a numbing prospect. And I think that's what this album is. This, as Matt said, everything is pushed to the back by design. Mm-hmm. It's almost as if you recorded an entire album and then said, how can I make it 50% less prominent in all ways?
Put it underwater.
Yep, exactly. That's a great way to put it, Josh. And you did mention Thank You for Talking to Me, Africa, Matt. That is the only song where the whole Sly and the Family Stone band in it. And what you're calling the porno guitar is really, that's just slap bass, electric slap bass. That's Larry Graham playing the slap bass.
No, I didn't hear the porn stuff there. That was more in the wah-wah guitar that I was hearing.
You're saying the wah?
In other songs, yeah, the wow, chicka, wow, wow.
Okay, so the wah-wah, okay, so the wah-wah effects, gotcha. Okay, because I was going to say, because the bass is sometimes in it, like, too, like, and stuff like that. But
yeah, the bass in the last track was by far my favorite part of the
record. And that's really the only one that Larry Graham played on.
Yeah.
And that makes sense. And that's the one song that seemed like an old school Sly and the Family Stone. I think it was interesting he put it at the end because it was like a little bit of a feeling of hope on an album of despair. But yeah, I mean, you don't need to know much in terms of, you just need to look at the titles of the songs on this album and the name of the album itself to kind of get where he was at. And I don't think, Josh, this was an album designed for anybody besides Sly Stone. And it was a personal experience. And it was an experience where he was numbed by drug use and numbed by kind of like a loss of idealism. And so from that, I think it's just so stark because in 1969, he was pitching something so very different, both sound-wise, lyrically, and a vision. And it's just crazy to think that by 1971, he'd become so disillusioned. It's not only do you know that in terms of the narrative, you hear it instantaneously on these two albums. I think the other fascinating thing about this album is how often this album is sampled. This album is sampled constantly. De La Soul, Beastie Boys, all kinds of hip-hop artists have sampled this. So have people like Iggy Pop and John Legend and people like that as well. For being an album that is so minimalist and so dark and things pushed back and not stand out musical when you first hear it, it's fascinating how many grooves and rhythms people were able to sort of pull out of this. And there are some really good grooves in this. It's just you have to search for them.
Yes.
And you almost have to listen to it once or twice to get over the initial shock and then say, okay, I've now conditioned myself for that, the production. Now I'm going to go, searching for the music. And you can find it, but you have to kind of get through the overall mood and the muddiness that hides it.
But even, and I totally agree with that. But even when I did that, because I did listen to this album many times, it's still like I was still searching for it, and I did find it, but it never really made me go, "Oh, okay, now I get it. Now I'm feeling it." And it's just that production just really, and that's the other thing I think I took away. It sounds like it's almost like these are like studio sessions, right? That this is just them kind of playing around with stuff, getting ready to record the real album. This is the stuff that I would find would be in the, in the deluxe set. This would be kind of like the background, like the demos and stuff like that, because of the way the production is. So, and that's the thing. Their grooves are there. Like you can definitely you pick them out. And sometimes there was a couple times I was listening to it and I felt, okay, this is good, but it still was just like at the end of the day, it was just okay. It's fine, right? It just I never got to another level with it and really enjoyed it.
I also feel like it's kind of misleading to say this is a Sly and the Family Stone album coming off a Stand. You go in with expectations. I'm saying as somebody at that time period, thinking it's going to be something collaborative with all the other artists in the way, singing multiple singers and things like that. And this is very much a solo project. So obviously they're using the name to capitalize on the previous success, but it's like you said, it's clearly an album for him only, because I can appreciate this album more after our discussion, but having no context in listening to this, I don't know what you would think about that. I don't see how this wouldn't be an enjoyable listen or even necessarily a rewarding listen.
Yeah, John, did you like it? I haven't even heard your. Yeah. I mean, you're talking about it, but what is your opinion on?
This is a tough one. I can't say I liked it because it doesn't have a lot of re-listenability for me. I didn't hate it though.
Right.
This is one of the rare albums where I feel I need to listen to it more than 1 week allows me to. And when I first listened to this 2 weeks ago, it was because I'm usually a week ahead, just trying to give myself a little bit of space. It was a baffling listen. And then the second time I listened to it, I picked up some things. I don't think it's one of those albums where the more I listen to it, the more I'm going to like it necessarily. But I get this album not like I get it from similar lived experience. I get it in the context of 1971 and when it's released, because you're dealing with like death of the 60s type of energy, and that's a very different energy than late 60s energy. I think it's one of the reasons that people don't like to really revisit the early 70s as much as they like to revisit the 60s and maybe stuff later, because it was kind of a dark period. I know that the late 60s gets the rep of being a dark period, but when you think about it, the early 70s had a lot of the stuff the late 60s had, but also more, in terms of challenges. And I think that was a time that, it was just, I think one of the things is this album keeps going higher and higher in the charts when it gets looked at in revision, and a lot of that is African-American critics continue to move it up. And I think there's just a resonance with this album and like an understanding and a context with it that I think might be one of those things that, I like to sit back and read about, and maybe I can't totally understand, and so that interests me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the context and all those things does make it interesting, and he certainly seems like a fascinating, guy and who's going through a lot. But at the end of the day, I want to listen to music because I enjoy the music, and it's not right. Again. I don't hate this either, John. It's not like I'm like, oh, this is terrible, and it's not an offensive listen. It's just very different, especially when juxtaposed against the album that we covered before, with Stand, which was like a hit you in the face. I love this album right away, and it's like, and I don't mind. Artists, you're right, Josh. It's like, people that bought this were probably like, this isn't what I expect from Sly and the Family Stone. And I don't mind that. I prefer artists that change their sound and try different things. And sometimes it falls flat. So I don't mind that necessarily. I'm just saying, fine, do what you're doing. This is not something that I would want to listen to. There's plenty of other things I would much rather listen to, even within this genre of more of like a funk kind of a thing,
I agree, but this is funk only in terms of like the instrumentation being
Right.
played. It's a different. I'll kind of end with this on my take. This album actually, in many ways, reminded me of White Light, White Heat, which was an album I really disliked. Another album that was discordant, designed to make you uncomfortable, heavily influenced by very self-destructive drug use. I think the only difference, and maybe I should give context, because I said I don't hate this album, and I was pretty infamously said I don't like that White Light, White Heat album. I think the difference is that it's a much more subtle and non-offensive listen to get that, but it has some of the same properties that White Light, White Heat did, which is that it's sort of designed to make you uncomfortable because they were uncomfortable and they were chaotic. And I think it comes from a lot of the same spot that album did. So that might be a good comparative place, I think. Yeah. Yeah. So
big shrug emoji for me on this one.
Yeah, I can't really recommend it myself either.
Yeah, it's very hard for me because I can't recommend this album, but I also think it's one of those albums that if you are a person who aims to understand music, I think it's well worth listening to. I do think that there's a level of... I struggle sometimes with music that's so clearly drug influenced, like it seems to be the largest thread. It's hard for me to connect to that type of music sometimes, but this one's interesting. I heard it described as like a seductive picture of drug abuse, and I thought that was a very interesting way to put this, because I get that. And maybe I'd be interested to talk to someone who struggled with addiction issues to hear what their take is on this, because I feel like there's a resonance that maybe I just don't 100% understand. So,
well, I can tell you this doesn't make me want to go out and try drugs to try to recreate this experience. So it's a good anti-drug album in that regard for me.
There you go. Well, there you go. So
I was thinking of doing PCP, and then I listened to Sly and the Family Stone, and I decided
well, it's
not
funny
to,
because
so.
it doesn't sound like cocaine and PCP though, which I think is what's so interesting. Like I said, it sounds like musical like opium is the what more or heroin, or that would be the things which is opium. But I mean, that's kind of what it sounds like more, I think, than like a amphetamine or stimulant, right? It certainly doesn't have so
no.
Very, very interesting album. So I'll be interested to hear feedback from the audience.